The monorail was already 8 minutes late, and that was bad. In fact, it meant that it wouldn't be coming, and the passengers crowded at the stop would have to wait for the next one and then try to cram themselves into its gut, heated by the sun and hundreds of bodies. Axel rubbed his cheek with the fingers of his left hand and squeezed himself deeper into the coolness of the shade. The concrete fence of the factory was high, but the sun crept inexorably across the pale city sky, burning through the dirty yellow smog, and the patch of protective shadow grew narrower. It was better not to look towards the downtown without sunglasses. The geometric sprout of high-rise buildings, which housed the offices of large corporations, shone with fierce reflected light. The polarization of the windows was working hard, reflecting the sun's radiation on those who could not afford such a luxury. It was almost impossible to imagine that the city once had been the little, cozy capital of a small northern country with barely 500,000 population. Now, when global warming has almost completely displaced mankind from the tropical latitudes, the city has turned into a megalopolis, most of which was a massive development for the descendants of refugees. And the slums, as always, were coming as free extra. If it weren't so hot, he could walk, Axel thought. About 3 kilometers. It's possible, just 2 stops of the monorail train. When he'd gotten a job at the furniture factory in the winter, he'd walk to and from work daily. Most people, of course, would call, and absolutely right, such daily walks a total waste of time. But that wasn't the case for Axel. He had nothing against walking and had all the time in the world. If only it weren't for the heat. Axel wistfully remembered his job at the factory. The salary there was decent, and they treated him almost humanly, if only one could say so. Persons like him used to be hired in paint shops pretty often. They allowed the owners to save a lot of money on the ventilation system. Why bother with it if you can employ those who don't breathe at all? Unfortunately, the factory changed management in the spring, and new rules were immediately established. Instead of the promised room in the special dormitory, Axel was pointed at the door. But from time to time, they still threw in a one-time job for him, to clean the ventilation system that was now installed there. The monorail arrived, and the passengers rushed towards the doors. Elbows flashed, someone was shoved, someone was stepped on, and someone shouted hysterically high, foul language. Ultimately, not everyone got into the 3 shabby cars painted with unreadable graffiti. Unlucky ones stayed at the stop, desperately cursing the city government, corporations, and the transportation service. The public transportation in the city was going through some really hard times, and such scenes were becoming more and more common. The most surprising thing was that it was somehow blamed on people like Axel, although very few of his fellow folk risked using the monorail. From behind the abandoned building of the former hospital, dotted with its black, burned-out window sockets, a police drone slipped out and hovered over the bus stop. The people remaining there were already beginning the classic pre-fight ritual, with the obligatory pokes to each other's chests and ceremonial question, "Who the hell do you think you are?" No one initially paid any attention to the drone, but when a police skimmer appeared from around the corner of the building and moved leisurely toward the stop, everyone went quiet. The skimmer froze for a moment, just a few meters from the stop, shining its mirrored, opaque windows, just like those on skyscrapers. Then it abruptly sped away, showering people with a wave of small, hot debris and dust thrown up by the skimmer's hoverpods. No one even moved. Everyone realized the cops had done it on purpose, hoping someone would snap and be raked. The cyber judge could issue community service sentences at any speed, as fast as cops could provide him with the human material. The construction site of the new bulk island was desperately short of labor. That didn't concern Axel and his fellow misfits, however. He wanted to check his face again, but this time, distracted by the scene at the stop, he tried it with his right arm. The fingers, which had lost all sensitivity, almost pierced his cheek. Shit! Axel quickly turned away, hoping the people who were still busy arguing wouldn't notice anything. They didn't. Tired from the long wait, the failed scuffle, and the police attention, they continued to bicker languidly, oblivious to the lone, hunched figure huddled in a patch of shadows a few meters from the grimy and filthy monorail stop pavilion. Axel furtively pulled a small mirror from his pocket and assessed the damage. He didn't pierce the synth flesh, but that was all the good news. The synth flesh was stretched, sagging in unnatural folds, like a bulldog's face. In addition, there were small cracks in the leatherette around the wings of the nose, a clear sign that it was about to burst and slide down, exposing the unsightly thing it was supposed to hide. It was impossible to get into the cramped monorail car like this. They would crush him, trample, tear off everything that could be torn off. Axel looked longingly along the street. Okay, he could make part of his way through the park, hiding under the trees. There was a fee to enter the park, and that's why most of the locals, mostly unemployed in the third or fourth generation, didn't go there. But Axel had found a 10-entry pass on the street a month ago, which still had 3 visits left on it. Once inside, a slowly walking figure would not be of interest to anybody. But after that, he has to walk almost a kilometer through the open, all the way to the old harbor. There was a makeshift shelter gallery, made of various construction debris from the harbor gates to the half-submerged ferry, where Axel and his people lived. The gallery was regularly set on fire by aggressive residents of the harbor area, and just as regularly, those who dwelled on the ferry rebuilt it. But it was still a long way. The monorail stop was a minute's walk from the harbor gate, but it was now off limits for him. Axel turned and, trying to keep to the rapidly shrinking shade, hobbled along the fence toward the park entrance.
Today was Tassie's day of discovery, a big and very important discovery. Today she learned that you can't make a good sand figure out of dry, crumbly sand. For quality, you must shovel the top warm sand aside and scoop up wet, cool, and dark sand from the depths. Then, you need to put them not in the sun but on the side of the sandbox, which was covered by the shadow of a large chestnut tree, partially overhanging the playground, so that they do not fall apart in a minute. It was so great and exciting that the production of sand things went non-stop, and only an unexpectedly fallen nearby piece of something incomprehensible distracted her from this. Tassie thoughtfully reached for the fallen object, which most resembled a piece of her mother's favorite leather bag, only in a different color. Her mother's bag was white, but this one was pink, like Tassie's palm. Then, someone's shadow fell on Tassie, and the girl looked up. "Mommy! Mommy!" A young woman, whose face clearly showed the same features as 4-year-old Tassie's, broke away from the book and looked at the girl running to her. "What is it, Sunshine? Played enough?" Tassie ran up to her mother and climbed onto the bench next to her. "Mom, a secret!" The woman smiled and bent her head to her daughter. "Well, come on, tell me, but quietly." The girl wrapped both hands around her mother's head, pulled her to herself, and whispered directly into her ear, "Mommy, there was a man and he has lost his face. Completely." She laughed happily and ran back to the sandbox, from which a skinny figure was shuffling away down the shady alley. The woman shook her head, smiling. Yesterday, she and her husband had been discussing the peculiarities of Japanese etiquette. Who would have thought the girl had such a wonderful memory for words? Maybe it's time to get serious about teaching her to read.
Axel stood at the park exit, hiding behind a broken and vandalized hollow advertisement bollard, staring at the harbor in despair. To get home, he would have to walk down the hillside along a scratched, shaky concrete fence covered in thick layers of spray paint. And only then would he reach the relative safety of the harbor area. A long walk over the open ground, without the slightest shade. Because of the midday heat, the place was empty now. The inhabitants of the ugly, monotonous neighborhoods that sprawled geometrically along the foot of the hill usually put a very different meaning to the word walk anyway. Their walks usually involved night and danger. Still, there were some relatively decent people among them. A few people strolled along the old path that cut through the yellowed grass of the hill, heading towards the park and the city center. Probably lost the battle for a seat on the monorail car, too. He remembered meeting the girl's eyes as he bent over to pick up the torn-off piece of synth flesh that covered his face. A sweet, innocent child. Axel had expected the girl to scream, to be frightened, but she did not yet know what death was, what rot and decay were. So the sight of decayed flesh, with teeth and skull bones peeping through the gaps, brought her not terror, but delight and surprise. The strange man's face had been torn off. He questioned himself over and over again. Why wasn't he gifted the decency to die properly? He is devoid of breath, devoid of voice, devoid of warmth and blood, but he is still moving. He still needs to eat to delay decay. No stupid brain hunt from horror movies. Just regular food. Of course, he wouldn't be allowed into a store, even an automatic one, let alone a restaurant. The security guards and other staff couldn't be fooled by any synth flesh, not even the most expensive. But there were few volunteers still willing to do the grocery for them. Few real, living people who were still visiting and helping the old ferry community. The worst part was that Axel, like all his fellow folk, retained reason, memory, and emotion. Many, of course, could not bear it. The living dead can't commit suicide. The term self-destruction was more appropriate. But Axel decided to continue his existence. Because of the children in the community. Somebody needs to take care of them. Somebody needs to put bread on the table. Technically, there was no prohibition against hiring the living dead. It's just that most people avoided them, even though everyone had long ago known that it wasn't contagious. When terrorists from the Green Earth Glory Group detonated several charges in the East, spraying a pseudo-virus, panic broke out in the city. People, gripped by terror, even attacked and set fire to hospitals where doctors were trying to help those infiltrated by microscopic nanobots stolen from the Pan-Asian Conclave's secret labs. But then, when the terrorists were already eliminated, it turned out that the nanobots did not reproduce in any way, and having effectively destroyed most of the biological functions of humans, they continued to maintain some strange artificial semblance of life in them. The Conclave wanted to create invulnerable immortal soldiers, but they failed. Nanobots created a pathetic, helpless parody of life. The living dead couldn't hurt anyone, so fragile and vulnerable were they. They were spat upon and dismissed. But they weren't considered individuals either. You could do anything with them. Trick them, shoot them, run them down with a skimmer, douse them with gasoline, and set them on fire because what doesn't breathe can't scream. Formally, they were all recognized as dead. Each had an official death certificate, and the normal rights of an ordinary person were no longer applicable to them. Once in a while, the ghetto's inhabitants were given a chance to earn some money, but those chances were running out, just as those who dared to step off the ferry and out of the gates were fewer and fewer. Axel stepped out from behind the bollard and waddled down the slope, pulling the visor of his baseball cap down over his eyes and trying to look only at his feet. With each step, he felt the sun, the worst enemy of the living dead, drying out his fragile body, which had long since been irrigated with warm blood. The sun penetrated his clothes, turning the remains of muscles and ligaments into brittle threads that a handful of nanobots would no longer be able to revive. He couldn't feel pain, but his soul was being turned inside out by despair. He must get there. He must bring the money home for the children and the community. The bright orange flying disc spun rapidly up the slope and flashed over the walkway, nearly hitting an unsuspecting bystander on the shoulder. But the techno-geek was more interested in whatever was going on within his VR goggles than what was up around him. A young guy of about 18, dressed in shorts and a toxic green t-shirt, jumped up with his arm outstretched, but still could not intercept the disc that suddenly took a sharp turn. The disc fell into the grass a few meters away from him and rolled, bouncing, until it was stopped by some disorderly pile of rags. "If you keep passing like that, we'll blow the next game," Chobi said, heading for the orange disc. "We came here to practice, not to knock hats off people." "You need to react faster," his buddy said as he approached. He was dressed the same way, except his shirt was blue. "By the way, no one will warn you about the pass in the game, so stay frosty and use your brain." What the hell is that?" Chobi picked up the orange disc from the ground and stared in surprise at the grinning skull staring out from under it. The skull was lying near an entire skeleton, dressed in worn jeans and a shabby sweatshirt. A yellow baseball cap had fallen off the skull, exposing crumbling dark hair. Everything was sprayed with a thin gray dust. "Dyke, I think it's a zombie," Chobi said. "I thought I noticed it hobbling around. Probably dried up, stinker, didn't make it to his dump." He nodded toward the old harbor. "That was fast, though." He kicked the skeleton with his foot. The bones beneath the clothes cracked. The skeleton's sweatshirt rippled, and a crumpled wad of bills rolled out of its pocket. "Holy shit," Dyke said, picking up the money. "Just look what we got here, a stinker with the cash. Bro, it's almost 8 grand. Comes in handy. I was looking for new sneakers." "No way," Chobi said. "What is he, your property? Let's split it." Dyke shrugged. "Well, I'm good with the half," he agreed readily. "I wonder what the hell he needed the money for, and where did he get it?" "Who bloody cares," Chobi said. "Probably stole it somewhere. Now he's all bones, so I don't give a damn. It's not like they need to buy some food. Why would the dead need to eat? By the way, I could use a snack. Hey, why don't we go to that steak diner place since we have the cash? You know, the one to the left of the beach? That's some good thinking," Dyke said. "I'm in on it." He kicked the skeleton too. "Have a good day, buddy. Thanks for the dough." They walked down the slope, followed by the glance of empty eye sockets, through which a light breeze quietly sifted something that looked like dry tears or gray dust.